Okay, currently on the topic of free knowledge of God, the natural knowledge of God, divine omniscience, and the very concept of the divine decree and how that relates to free choice. And to recap what we've covered, I've looked at, like I said, the very concepts of natural knowledge, middle knowledge, free knowledge, libertarian choice, compatibilism, hard determinism, open theism. And then we reviewed a couple of key scriptures on the certainty of divine foreknowledge. So we've surveyed sort of where we're going, but now here's probably one of the most important things that biblical and theological thinkers have to do in approaching this question. I mean, and the first thing is that, remember, we're doing systematic theology with also adding an apologetic emphasis, or what we called Elenctic theology or polemical theology, and we talked about this in Prolegomena. And what's important here in the discussions is that you cannot have a free choice discussion by itself when you're doing systematic theology, because the concept of human free agency or free choice always has to be in the context of an eternal divine decree and God's outworking of that decree in divine providence. So it's never one without the other. And as we've seen from texts like Isaiah 46, Acts 2, Acts 13, is that God seems to be really confident that everything that he decreed is certainly going to come to pass. And in texts like in Ephesians 1, where it talks about God working all things after the counsel of his will, again, as we'll see, there's good arguments to be made that everything that happens is decreed by God, and yet we are sufficiently free for there to be, again, praise and blame in an appropriate way, because we can freely choose to obey the law of God or disobey the law of God appropriately. So that said, if you're going to do a free choice analysis, we're on roughly on page 6 of the syllabus for the decree. And I want to give you about 7 basic ideas that are additional factors in thinking about this issue that they're omitted from a lot of modern texts and discussions of the issue, but that's why I use older texts from Protestant scholasticism, from Shedd's theology from the 19th century. It includes more of these concepts. So first, when you think about free choice, first thing to consider is, are there any external agents involved? Okay. And that's something I discussed in the last segment, is there any, for example, external efficient causation that's occurring? Because if that's happening, then your thoughts and choices are not self-caused. The movement of your intellect and will, which is an effect, is actually produced by something external. And if that's true, then yes, you've got hard determinism and no meaningful sense of praise or blame, punishment, reward, and so forth. So that we're avoiding. So you want to think about the question of how are external agents involved here, particularly causal agents. So the second issue, we talk about material and internal causes, okay? So that is, what does it mean for you with respect to human nature? Now that's really the material cause, is what's the cause acting, and what's the material that's working. And the internal cause is important because you, as the free act agent, it's important as well. What's going on inside of you? What are your thoughts, your choices, your memories, your inclinations? How are you valuing things? That's probably one of the most important things. Now I say that because we'll look at the idea of liberty of nature and necessity of nature as concepts. And that is actually probably the most important factor, whether you're a compatibilist or a libertarian, and thinking about choice, because if you look at those two, and I've got those definitions listed in the syllabus in the next couple of pages, is that liberty of nature and necessity of nature really comes down to two things. It's that a being is only as free, okay, as your nature permits, okay, and every being is limited by its nature with respect to its freedoms. So that said, for example, even God is limited with respect to what God can do. God is an immutable holy being, so the Bible says he cannot lie, okay? God cannot choose to cease to exist. So even, given the nature of God, there are still limitations on the choices he can make. Now you move into human nature, and this is where we get probably the most important factor where we get a debate among Christians, whether you're a Calvinist, Arminian, a Lutheran, a Molinist, how you might fit in here, is that the real issue is first the nature of the human being involved. And that's why you've got to look at the doctrine of sin or hamartiology and its conclusions to even think about what kinds of choices human beings can make. Because when we start thinking about the concept of Augustinian original sin, we're thinking about the concept of total inability, because human nature is corrupt and defective. The heart is curved in on itself, as some of the scholastics and Martin Luther said, is at the very core of our being we're selfish. And that, so as they say, it's the heart curved in on itself that results in concupiscence, the strong desire to sin and serve ourselves. And we look at the orientation of our heart as concupiscence, or the idea of selfish desire. Well, guess what? How you are oriented affects how you think and how you choose. So if you get to the point where, for example, in the Calvinistic or Reformed systems, where you have total inability because of this defective heart, now think about this. The question is, what can a human being with a defective heart freely choose? Now the answer is all sorts of things. You can choose to go to Burger King or McDonald's or Chipotle, freely. But one thing you're not going to choose apart from divine grace is desire and want to choose Christ, because your nature is defective. Okay, and this is why, again, answering that liberty of nature, necessity of nature question, how sinful are human beings and human nature, particularly with the will and the state of the heart after the fall of Adam and Eve. Okay. Now, once you've answered that, if you get to the point where we're at here at Biola, where we believe in original sin, where it's total inability, and that apart from God's initiating some kind of divine grace that enables you to believe, and this is significant, when you get to the point of why are some people elect for salvation and others not, it's important to understand that we're thinking here about divine foreknowledge. Well, God in his conceptual knowledge can't foresee anybody believing in Christ if they don't have the nature to do it. If their hearts are so defective that they all hate God by their very nature, then God can foresee and put someone in every human being, every fallen human being, in every possible circumstance and condition, and they will never believe because their nature is defective. And so this is why, unless you answer that question first on the defectiveness of nature, you can't answer a question on the foreseeability of faith or something like that. And by the way, when we get to the doctrine of the atonement and soteriology, again, Calvinists, Lutherans, Arminians will answer this question differently, but all would agree that original sin is correct, although what Calvinists would offer is that, yes, we're totally unable, but only the elect get this prevenient grace that actually regenerates, that enables us to believe. And then the Arminians would say, no, there's a prevenient grace that doesn't regenerate, but it's given to all people retroactively to the beginning of the fall of mankind, and that enables everybody to possibly believe. So here it's important because God is the one who initiates the act of grace for us to be able to believe. It's not our own ability, which would be some kind of Pelagianism or semi-Pelagianism. So all that to say, when you're thinking about a free choice analysis, think about this, because liberty of nature, necessity of nature, and again, that's number 2 on this list here, the material and internal causes, okay? What's the nature of the thing involved? Is that, think about this, if someone has a dog nature, okay? Dogs can freely choose to bark, freely choose to chase cats, but a dog can't freely choose to engage in the Calvinist-Arminian debate or choose Christ for salvation, because a dog is limited to the kinds of choices that a dog nature can choose. So if you want to understand the liberty of nature and necessity of nature issues, just think about what a dog nature can do versus a human nature, and the importance of defining that defect in human nature when you think about foreseeing faith and all these other kinds of freedoms. So next, number 3, all the issues that we talked about already related to the divine nature, the faculties, their operations. When we talk about our free choices, the point is God has an eternal plan. We talked about the formation of it with God's natural and free knowledge, and if you hold to it, the middle knowledge. And with all of that, the fact is God has a conceptual knowledge based on his omniscience, his wisdom, his goodness, his holiness, his righteousness, his justice, and ultimately, without anything else existing or influencing God, God by himself conceived of a plan which arguably is a plan for the best possible world that he could create, made a divine decision with the divine will that he would make out of all the possible worlds, this world, which would be the best of all possible worlds. And based on that, that results in God's free knowledge, which the content of which we call the divine decree. Okay? So that's basically the content of everything that's going to happen from now to eternity. Number 4, I mentioned, how does this work with the practical intellect and will for human beings? Again, people talk about free choice, but we have to talk about substantive theological psychology because it's not just the will, and will even there is equivocal, where will as orientation or will as a capacity to choose. Because when we think about substantive theological psychology, especially in the ordering of thoughts and choices and feelings with the intellect, will, and affections. The fact is that in a Thomistic model, you've got to have thoughts and deliberations and valuations of objects and all sorts of things before you have an appetite for them. And for us, that has to do with truth concepts. Again, we think about what's good and true and beautiful. These are the things we have an appetite for. But the first thing is, if it's not true, we can identify phony things as being good or beautiful or true, and then you have an appetite for the wrong thing. I'll talk more about that when we get to the doctrine of sin. But this is why the Bible emphasizes truth more than anything else, because if you know the truth sets you free. If you misidentify something as good, true, and beautiful, you have an appetite for the wrong thing and you choose it. So the Bible emphasizes what? Get rid of the lies and believe the truth. And that only comes from renewing the mind. And more importantly, that it doesn't happen automatically. You got to choose to seek the truth, want to change your mind if you encounter it. It doesn't happen automatically. So if you're stunted in your growth in the Christian life, probably because you stopped seeking truth and stopped being willing to change your mind about right and wrong and other ideas. So this is why invite God to bother you, to convict you, but you got to have a love of the truth because you want to know reality as it is with respect to God, Christ, the Holy Spirit, and so forth. Couple more here. Again, number 5 relates to the material issues, material internal causes, which is the goodness or evil of the object making the choice. Again, so that relates to, again, the material and internal causes. If you're evil and selfish, I mean, what can a demon choose to do? Take that as a clear example. What can Satan choose to do? Satan has an evil angel nature, okay? So he's going to choose the things that an evil angel with a bad heart would choose. So that's why you think about the goodness or evil of the object, which is really the state of the heart, and how many lies do they believe about what's good, true, and beautiful, okay? Because whatever you value, that's what you're going to have an appetite for and be drawn to. So that's why, again, we emphasize the truth. Then when we think about the thought and the choice itself, with respect to free choice, you've just got to think about every antecedent condition and circumstance and every concurrent circumstance and condition in every thought and choice that you make. I gave the example in another lecture of the idea that, for example, one of the capacities we have in the image of God is language. But for example, I can't freely choose right now to speak Swahili because I don't know Swahili. So even though I have freedom, I can't freely choose to do that. Why? Because in the antecedent circumstances and conditions, I never learned Swahili. So therefore, in the contemporary circumstances and conditions, I can't freely choose to speak it. Now I can choose right now to start learning it, and then at some point choose to speak it. Okay, but I don't have absolute freedom to do whatever I want. That's, again, it's restrictive to antecedent and concurrent circumstances and conditions. I know how to swim, but there's no water around right now, so I can't make the choice to swim. So that's why when you start thinking about all of the possible choices, remember a lot of this comes down to, is God fair if everyone doesn't have a chance for salvation? I'll address that more when we get to Christology and soteriology and other things in essential Christian doctrine too. But this is the very important stuff. Finally, and then we'll stop this segment, the existence of the act agent. Now I say this because there's a lot of talk about, well, God foreseeing what we would choose. What's significant is that, again, God does not have perceptual knowledge of something that exists that is external to him prior to the first moment of creation. Prior to that, God only has a conceptual knowledge. God would know our essence perfectly. He would know everything about our DNA, our genetics, the state of our soul, so on and so on and so forth. And then he would know where we're born, every influence that we would have. But the point is, we don't exist. So the idea that God would know with certainty what we would do or what we will do, based on where you're at on middle knowledge or not. The fact is that we don't exist, and God is not perceiving, in effect, his eternal television set to actually see something. God is conceiving with the divine intellect every possible state of affairs, with every possible person, again, with a particular essence. So that's why existence itself is important, because, again, we have to go back to these are concepts in the mind of God when he's making this eternal decree. So all that to say, in the next segment, we're going to be clarifying a couple of the major types of causation, because if you want to maintain freedom, you have to maintain, as I said, minimally, staying away from the external efficient causation of the intellect and the will. And you have to maintain that the person, the act agent, him or herself, is the sole efficient cause of your thoughts and choices. And if you maintain that, like I said, we'll at least the compatibilist and the libertarian will say that's enough for practical freedom. All right, I'll see you in the next segment.